By the end of 1941, the Axis powers had suffered their first major strategic setback with the failure of Operation Barbarossa to swiftly conquer the Soviet Union. However, despite the massive commitment of German resources to the Eastern Front, a crucial and relentless campaign continued in a theater often overshadowed by the larger conflicts, North Africa. This sprawling, harsh, desert war fought across the vast territories of Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and French North Africa was not a sideshow. It was a campaign of immense strategic importance that served as the critical pivot point for control of the Mediterranean Sea and, ultimately, determined the viability of opening a second front in Europe. The strategic importance of North Africa was derived from two core, non-negotiable geopolitical objectives for the Allied powers. The first was the defense of the Suez Canal. This narrow, man-made waterway in Egypt was, quite simply, the jugular vein of the British Empire. It provided the shortest, fastest maritime connection between Great Britain and its crucial eastern territories and colonies, particularly India, Australia, and the oil-rich regions of the Middle East. If the German and Italian forces succeeded in seizing the canal, Britain would be forced to divert all its vital military and merchant shipping around the entire continent of Africa via the immensely long and dangerous route around the Cape of Good Hope. This massive logistical strain would have immediately crippled the British war effort, causing critical delays in fuel and troop transport and potentially leading to the collapse of the British position in the East. Protecting the canal was, therefore, an existential necessity for Britain. The second major objective was the control of the entire Mediterranean Sea, with Germany occupying France and exerting strong influence over Italy. The central Mediterranean was a perilous zone, often referred to as a no-go area for Allied shipping. The Axis controlled major points of access and crucial islands, allowing them to effectively sever the direct sea route between Britain and the crucial Eastern Front supply hubs. By defeating the Axis forces in North Africa, the Allies would effectively secure the entire southern shore of the Mediterranean, allowing them to reopen the vital sea lanes. Reopening these lanes would drastically reduce the time and resources needed to supply forces in the East and, most importantly, provide the necessary staging grounds for the next logical step in the strategic plan, the invasion of continental Europe, targeting what Winston Churchill famously termed the soft underbelly of the Axis in southern Europe. On the Axis side, the campaign was driven by ambition and a similar desire for crucial resources. The initial drive was spearheaded by Italy, which sought to expand its colonial empire, link its territories in Libya and Italian East Africa, and fulfill the ambition of controlling the Mare Nostrum Sea. However, the massive Italian failures in 1940 quickly necessitated the intervention of the elite German force, the Afrika Korps, led by the brilliant and highly aggressive General Erwin Rommel. For Germany, the North African campaign was a means to an end, securing the oil fields of the Middle East and dealing a final, crippling blow to the British Empire by seizing the Suez Canal. Rommel's objective was to drive the British out of Egypt and turn the entire strategic balance of power in the region. The core of the conflict was defined by the harsh, unrelenting environment. The North African desert was a vast, featureless expanse characterized by extreme heat, freezing nights, massive sandstorms, and a chronic lack of water and reliable infrastructure. Logistical support was critical. Both sides operated at the extreme end of their supply lines, and the fighting was characterized by dramatic, rapid movements of mechanized forces across the desert floor, a true war of maneuver and supply. The side that could successfully supply its tanks, fuel, and water over the immense distances had the strategic advantage. This brutal struggle led to an unprecedented level of respect between the opposing front-line commanders. Despite the immense scale of the violence, the entire theater served as a critical testing ground for the Allied forces, particularly the emerging American and the reorganized British armies, preparing them for the demands of the European invasion. The conflict that raged across the immense, arid territories of North Africa was not simply a war of tanks and soldiers. It was a deeply personal and strategic clash between two vastly different military cultures and two of the most famous generals of the entire war. Understanding the strengths, weaknesses, and command structures of the opposing forces is vital to comprehending the fluid, dramatic nature of the campaign, which saw immense swings of fortune across the desert. On the side of the Axis powers, the offensive thrust was spearheaded by the elite German Expeditionary Force, often known simply as the Desert Force, which was commanded by the supremely aggressive and brilliant field commander Erwin Rommel. Rommel quickly earned a legendary reputation across both enemy lines for his tactical audacity, his deep understanding of mechanized maneuver in the extreme environment, and his ability to repeatedly achieve operational successes with forces that were often numerically and logistically inferior to his British counterparts. The German core of this force, comprising potent tank divisions, reconnaissance units, and specialized mobile infantry, was exceptionally well trained, highly motivated, and structurally optimized for the mobile, high-speed warfare demanded by the featureless desert terrain. However, the German force was critically reliant on its Italian allies, who provided the vast bulk of the infantry and support units necessary to hold ground. While the Italian soldiers fought with courage, their equipment was often outdated, their logistical system was fragile, and their command structure frequently lacked the same aggressive dynamism as their German partners. More fatally, the entire Axis operation was inherently crippled by one fundamental, non-negotiable weakness: the fragility of their supply lines. All essential supplies, fuel, and reinforcements had to travel across the vulnerable Mediterranean Sea, running a deadly gauntlet of concentrated British air and naval power operating from Malta and Alexandria. Rommel's tactical genius was repeatedly undermined by the inability of his supply ships to reach port, leading to a constant, desperate shortage of fuel and spare parts for his crucial tank divisions. Opposing this formidable German-Italian alliance was the resilient British Eighth Army, which evolved throughout the campaign into a highly professional and robust fighting force. The initial years of the war saw the British Army suffer numerous painful setbacks and strategic confusion, primarily due to inconsistent leadership and a rapid turnover of commanders. However, the situation was completely transformed in August 1942 with the arrival of General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was the antithesis of the dashing, risk-taking Rommel. He was meticulous, profoundly cautious, and utterly convinced of the need for overwhelming material superiority and exhaustive planning before any major offensive. Montgomery's greatest immediate contribution was not tactical brilliance in maneuver, but a complete restructuring and revitalization of the Eighth Army's morale. He restored the soldiers' confidence, insisting that the army would never retreat again and instilling a belief that they possessed superior strength and discipline. By late 1942, the Eighth Army was equipped with a substantial numerical advantage in troops and, crucially, was receiving massive shipments of modern, powerful American equipment, including the formidable M4 Sherman tank, which finally gave them a decisive edge over the aging German and Italian armor. The British forces also benefited from a fundamentally superior logistical system, supplied via the relatively secure route around South Africa and with naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, ensuring that, when Montgomery chose to fight, he did so with abundant fuel, ammunition, and fully operational tanks. The arrival of American military forces in November 1942, as part of Operation Torch, added a new, critical dimension to the conflict. While American troops were enthusiastic and well-equipped, they were largely inexperienced in the harsh, unique demands of large-scale desert warfare and mobile tank campaigns. Their early engagements, particularly in Tunisia, would expose significant tactical and leadership shortcomings, forcing a steep and bloody learning curve. However, the American commitment brought with it the promise of nearly limitless industrial capacity and manpower, a long-term strategic factor that fundamentally guaranteed the Axis's eventual defeat. Regardless of Rommel's tactical brilliance, the entire North African campaign was therefore a complex, shifting battle of attrition, logistics, and contrasting leadership styles, the aggressive, resource-starved genius of Rommel facing the cautious, material-rich determination of Montgomery, soon to be joined by the vast, learning power of the American forces. The ultimate victor would not necessarily be the most brilliant tactician, but the commander who could ensure his fighting machines received fuel and supplies across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. Following months of dramatic, high-speed maneuvers and agonizing strategic retreats across the vast North African desert, a period often referred to as the tug-of-war for the desert, the Axis offensive, spearheaded by Field Commander Rommel's formidable German desert force, reached the absolute limit of its advance in the summer of 1942. The British defense was pushed back relentlessly across Libya and deep into Egypt, forcing them to take their final, desperate stand at a location of immense and irreversible strategic significance, El Alamein. This position, situated barely 60 miles west of the vital port of Alexandria and the Suez Canal, represented the last viable defensive line before the ultimate catastrophe. Had the Germans broken through here, the entire British strategic position in the Middle East and indeed the war's global logistics would have collapsed. The choice of El Alamein as the final defensive line was not accidental. It was dictated by the unique geography of the region. The line stretched for only about 40 miles between the Mediterranean Sea in the north and the treacherous, impassable Qatar Depression, a vast area of soft sand, salt marshes, and quicksand in the south. This geographical bottleneck meant that the British line could not be easily outflanked, forcing Rommel to commit to a frontal assault against a concentrated and increasingly fortified defense. There was no more room for retreat. The campaign had, by necessity, transitioned from a fluid war of maneuver into a brutal battle of attrition and siege. The confrontation that followed, known as the First Battle of El Alamein, was fought between July 1st and July 27, 1942. This battle was not intended by the British as a decisive victory, but rather as a desperate, tenacious defense designed solely to stop Rommel's momentum and buy critical time for the army to reorganize and receive massive reinforcements. The British defense, though often chaotic in the face of Rommel's initial, aggressive probes, was characterized by fierce localized resistance. The commander of the British Eighth Army at the time, General Claude Auchinleck, had taken direct command of the front-line troops, demonstrating a resolve that stabilized the desperate situation. The British forces utilized the terrain's choke points and rapidly laid extensive minefields to channel the German and Italian tanks into predetermined killing zones where the concentrated fire of anti-tank guns could be most effectively brought to bear. Rommel's attack was launched with his characteristic speed, driven by the knowledge that his own logistical situation was rapidly deteriorating. He was severely low on fuel, a dependency made worse by the relentless British air and sea attacks on his Mediterranean supply convoys. He knew that if he could not break the British line immediately, the constant influx of British and American reinforcements would soon overwhelm him. His tanks, despite their superior German training, were physically and materially exhausted from the long advance. The battle quickly devolved into confused, fragmented fighting, often conducted at close quarters in the oppressive summer heat and dense dust clouds. The British defense held, absorbing the German punches and counterattacking fiercely, utilizing their numerical superiority in infantry and artillery. Even when their tank tactics were sometimes inferior, the most critical factor in stopping the German advance was the unwavering, tenacious defense of the key tactical positions, particularly the Ruisat Ridge, a small elevation that offered crucial observation over the surrounding battlefield. Repeated German attempts to seize this ridge were repelled, often resulting in heavy German losses. By the end of July, both sides were utterly exhausted, drained by the immense human cost and the relentless attrition. Rommel, recognizing the failure of his offensive to achieve a decisive breakthrough and facing critically low fuel and ammunition reserves, was forced to call off the attack and order his troops to dig in. The advance that had begun triumphantly months earlier had been definitively halted just short of the vital objectives. The immediate threat to the Suez Canal was averted, and the British Army, though battered, had won the crucial time needed to prepare for the great counteroffensive that would follow. Now under the new command of General Bernard Montgomery, the survival of the British position hung on this desperate defense. Following the desperate defensive actions of the first engagement at El Alamein, which succeeded only in halting the German advance in July 1942, the entire strategic landscape of the North African conflict was revolutionized by a profound change in leadership and material advantage. The command of the British Eighth Army was formally assumed by General Bernard Montgomery in August 1942. Montgomery's arrival marked an immediate and absolute end to the long, demoralizing period of strategic retreat and uncertainty that had plagued the British forces. His primary focus was not on immediate maneuvering, but on meticulous preparation, overwhelming material superiority, and, most importantly, the psychological restoration of the Army's morale. Montgomery instilled a deep, almost fanatical confidence, declaring publicly and privately that the Eighth Army would never retreat again and that its next move would be the final, decisive offensive to drive the Axis forces permanently out of Africa. The subsequent phase of the battle, known as the Second Battle of El Alamein, was fought from October 23 to November 4, 1942. This confrontation was characterized by the immense, coordinated application of Allied firepower, a direct contrast to the fluid, risky campaigns favored by the German command. Montgomery insisted on waiting until he had achieved a non-negotiable, crushing material superiority across all combat metrics. By the time he was ready to strike, the British and Commonwealth forces commanded roughly 220,000 men against the German and Italian force of approximately 115,000. More critically, the Allies possessed a devastating advantage in tanks, fielding over 1,000 operational tanks, including hundreds of the powerful, newly arrived M4 Sherman medium tanks supplied by the United States through the vital American supply effort against the Axis forces severely limited approximately 550 operational tanks. This overwhelming numerical advantage, coupled with a crushing superiority in artillery and air support, ensured that the battle would be won by sheer, focused weight of metal. The battle plan itself was executed with painstaking precision, a testament to Montgomery's cautious planning style. The operation was divided into distinct phases, beginning with Operation Lightfoot, the initial infantry advance designed to clear two wide lanes through the dense, intricate German and Italian minefields. This phase was followed by Operation Supercharge, which would unleash the armored divisions through the cleared lanes into the enemy's rear positions. To deceive the already exhausted German commander, Rommel, the Allies orchestrated elaborate deception plans, including the construction of dummy supply depots and phantom tank movements on the southern flank, successfully drawing German attention away from the true, decisive point of attack in the north. The initial fighting was brutally slow and agonizingly costly for the Allies, emphasizing the difficulty of fighting through the dense minefields and the dug-in German anti-tank positions. The intense, protracted combat was primarily focused on a small, concentrated northern sector of the line. The British and Commonwealth infantry fought relentlessly, clearing the miles of extensive German and Italian mines, one slow yard at a time, often taking heavy casualties. The German and Italian defense, fighting desperately without hope of adequate fuel or reinforcement, proved tenacious. However, the continuous, overwhelming Allied artillery bombardment fired by 3 times the number of guns possessed by the Axis slowly, inexorably wore down the German and Italian fighting strength and reserve capacity. The strategic breakthrough finally came during Operation Supercharge, when the Allied armored divisions successfully punched through the final defensive layers. Rommel, recognizing the complete exhaustion of his tank reserves and the overwhelming superiority of the fresh British armored units, began a desperate, orderly retreat. Hitler, in a critical, strategically flawed decision, intervened directly and issued a disastrous stand-fast order, forbidding any further retreat. This order, which Rommel was forced to initially obey, ensured that valuable German and Italian units were sacrificed needlessly in futile defensive positions, allowing the advancing British to capture thousands of exhausted troops and massive amounts of equipment, the Axis forces suffered catastrophic, irreversible losses in both men and material. The victory at El Alamein was a turning point of immense global significance. It permanently eliminated the Axis threat to the Suez Canal and the Middle East, securing the critical lines of supply for the Allied war effort. For the British, it was a vital, morale-boosting victory, restoring their prestige and demonstrating that the German army could be definitively defeated in open battle. As Winston Churchill famously remarked, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." This victory ensured that the Axis dream of linking forces across North Africa and seizing the Middle Eastern oil fields was dead, setting the stage for the next great strategic move, the comprehensive expulsion of the German and Italian forces from the entire North African continent. With the British Eighth Army successfully holding the Axis at El Alamein, securing the vital Suez Canal, the Allied focus immediately shifted to securing the entire Mediterranean basin and establishing the foundation for a future European invasion. This monumental task required a new level of strategic coordination between the primary partners, Great Britain and the United States. The planning for the comprehensive invasion of French North Africa, codenamed Operation Torch, became the critical subject of intense, often difficult, high-level strategic debate that revealed a fundamental divide in the way the two nations viewed the prosecution of the war. The core of the strategic disagreement lay in the timing and location of the next major offensive. The American military leadership, strongly influenced by Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, was a staunch advocate of a direct, immediate strike across the English Channel and into Nazi-occupied France. This approach, known as Operation Sledgehammer, was favored for its directness and was based on the premise that only a massive, concentrated blow against the German mainland could quickly relieve the crushing pressure on the Soviet Union in the East. Marshall and the American commanders feared that any diversion of resources, especially an operation aimed at the soft underbelly of Europe, would delay the main invasion of France and, consequently, prolong the entire war. The American philosophy was to aim directly at the heart of the enemy. Conversely, the British political and military establishment, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, vehemently argued for a more cautious, peripheral strategy. Having endured the catastrophic losses of Dunkirk and the subsequent defense of the home islands, the British were acutely wary of launching a premature, costly cross-channel invasion against the highly experienced German forces. Churchill and his advisers pushed instead for the North African intervention Operation Torch. Their argument was powerfully pragmatic. A North African campaign was strategically safer, logistically feasible, would secure the entire Mediterranean, eliminate the Axis presence in Africa, and provide a necessary, less defended staging ground for future attacks on Europe, specifically targeting Italy. The British feared Sledgehammer would fail and sought to build strength through smaller, successful campaigns. The strategic debate came to a head at the crucial Arcadia Conference in Washington, D.C., and later in July 1942, where President Franklin D. Roosevelt played the indispensable role of mediator. Roosevelt, while personally sympathetic to Marshall's desire for a direct attack, recognized the political necessity of getting American troops into combat against German forces immediately to maintain public and political morale, especially as the Soviet front was collapsing under the weight of the German summer offensive. More practically, he understood the logistical difficulty and the high risks associated with a massive invasion of France in 1942. Ultimately, the British argument for the African operation prevailed. The final decision was made. Operation Torch would proceed in November 1942. This operation represented the first massive, combined Anglo-American invasion of the war. Its objective was complex to the political instability in French North Africa, which was nominally controlled by the collaborationist Vichy regime. The invasion needed to be planned with the utmost secrecy to ensure surprise and to minimize resistance from the Vichy French forces, who were politically aligned with Germany, but whose colonial troops were generally reluctant to fight the Americans. The invasion was planned to target three major, widely separated landing areas along the North African coast, Casablanca in Morocco, and Oran and Algiers in Algeria. The overall commander appointed for the massive undertaking was the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a rising organizational genius who possessed the diplomatic skill necessary to manage the complex inter-allied command structure and the volatile political situation with the Vichy French forces. The success of Torch would irrevocably secure the Allied control of the Mediterranean and open the next great theater of war. The execution of Operation Torch, launched on November 8, 1942, was a logistical masterpiece and a political gamble of enormous proportions. It represented the first major, massive-scale, American military operation in the European theater against the Axis powers and was designed to land Allied forces simultaneously at three widely separated points along the coastline of French North Africa, Casablanca in Morocco, and Oran and Algiers in Algeria. The political complexity of the operation far exceeded the military challenge, as the target territory was controlled by the Vichy regime, the collaborationist French government, nominally allied with Germany. The success of the entire invasion hinged on achieving complete strategic surprise and minimizing the armed resistance from the local Vichy French forces, whose loyalty was deeply divided between the collaborationist government and the Free French forces led by General Charles de Gaulle. The invasion force itself was a colossal undertaking, involving a massive armada of over 100 warships and 400 transport vessels, carrying roughly 107,000 troops, primarily American, with significant British contingents in the eastern landings. Command of the entire operation was entrusted to the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose organizational genius and diplomatic skills were tested immediately by the dual challenge of coordinating an amphibious landing across hundreds of miles and simultaneously navigating the treacherous political landscape of French command structures. The landings were executed across the three primary sectors with varying degrees of resistance. The forces assigned to Casablanca, the westernmost objective in Morocco, were almost entirely American and met the most significant level of armed opposition. The French military forces, including naval units in the harbor and coastal defense batteries, fought fiercely for 3 days. Naval clashes off the coast were intense, with American naval vessels engaging French ships in sharp, protracted surface combat before the overwhelming power of the Allied fleet forced the French to cease fire. The intense fighting underscored the critical need for a political solution. In the central and eastern sectors, the forces landing at Oran and Algiers experienced a more fragmented and confused reaction, while the eastern landings near Algiers were swift and met with relatively light resistance, largely due to successful pre-invasion espionage and the swift neutralization of local Vichy commanders by secret Allied agents. The situation near Oran was more complex, involving heavier fighting that slowed the initial thrusts into the port city. The rapid seizure of Algiers was crucial because it provided the Allies with a major port that would immediately serve as the forward command post for the entire operation. The true moment of strategic success, however, was achieved not on the beaches but through political intrigue. Unbeknownst to the front-line commanders, prior to the invasion, Allied agents had secretly contacted high-ranking Vichy officials in North Africa. The key figure in this high-stakes political maneuvering was Admiral François Darlan, the commander-in-chief of all Vichy French armed forces and a profoundly anti-British figure who happened to be in Algiers at the moment of the invasion. Recognizing that the Axis could not possibly defend North Africa against the massive Anglo-American invasion, Darlan was convinced by diplomatic maneuvering to order the ceasefire across all French forces in North Africa only 2 days after the initial landings. This pivotal decision instantly ended the bloody and potentially lengthy resistance, saving thousands of lives and, most importantly, allowing the Allies to rapidly consolidate their forces and push eastward towards the ultimate objective, Tunis. The immediate cessation of French resistance meant the Allies achieved their primary goal of establishing a massive, secure foothold on the North African continent. However, the political fallout was immense. The Darlan deal, where the Allies publicly recognized Darlan as the provisional French authority in North Africa in exchange for the ceasefire, provoked outrage among the Free French forces and significant criticism from the American and British public, who viewed Darlan as a known Nazi collaborator. Nevertheless, the deal achieved its crucial military purpose. The ports were secured, the beaches were quiet, and the road was open for the next critical phase, the race to seize Tunisia before the Axis could pour in reinforcements. With the successful torch landing secured and the political complexities with the Vichy French forces temporarily resolved by the controversial Darlan ceasefire, the entire focus of the Allied command under General Dwight D. Eisenhower shifted immediately to the most vital, time-critical objective of the entire operation, the seizure of Tunis and Bizerte. These two major port cities in Tunisia represented the last major logistical and operational gateway for the Axis powers in North Africa, located just a short sea journey from Sicily and Italy. If the Allies could rush their mechanized forces eastward and capture these ports before the Axis could react and establish a strong defensive perimeter, the entire North African campaign could be concluded swiftly, perhaps before Christmas 1942. This desperate dash across hundreds of miles of poor road and mountainous terrain became known as the race for Tunis. The Allied plan was predicated on speed and exploiting the immense gap that existed between the westernmost Allied landings and the eastern Axis defensive lines. However, the plan was immediately hampered by several critical logistical and environmental factors that favored the defending Axis forces. Firstly, the Allied advance was launched from the poorly developed, congested ports of Algiers and Oran, which were hundreds of miles away from Tunis. The intervening terrain, especially as the columns moved into eastern Algeria and toward the Tunisian border, was dominated by the rugged, rain-soaked foothills of the Atlas Mountains, a sharp contrast to the flat, open desert where the Eighth Army was accustomed to fighting. The onset of the winter rainy season transformed the few available roads and tracks into quagmires of thick mud, rendering rapid movement of mechanized units and crucial supply trucks nearly impossible. Secondly, the Axis reaction to the torch landings was swift, decisive, and surgically effective. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, recognizing the catastrophic danger of losing the last African foothold, immediately launched Operation Element, an emergency airlift and sea lift to pour troops, tanks, and anti-tank weapons into the small, manageable perimeter around Tunis. These forces, primarily highly trained German paratroopers and armored units, were rapidly deployed directly into the key defensive positions and mountain passes bordering Tunisia. The German forces, operating over short, secure supply lines from Italy, were able to build up a substantial defensive perimeter far faster than the Allies could transport their attacking forces across the entire North African continent. The initial Allied push, led by the British First Army and supported by American and Free French units, was aggressive but ultimately too slow. By early December 1942, the Allied spearheads were within sight of Tunis and Bizerte, but they were exhausted, undersupplied, and vulnerable. The German defenders, now firmly dug in and supported by newly arrived anti-tank artillery, effectively utilized the terrain of the mountain passes to stop the Allied advance cold. The most critical failure occurred in the final, desperate push on Tebrba, where an Allied attempt to cut the road to Bizerte was decisively repulsed by fierce German counterattacks. The Allies, facing stiffening resistance, freezing cold, and roads turned to mud, were unable to deliver the necessary continuous pressure to achieve a breakthrough. By the second week of December, the Allied commanders were forced to confront the harsh reality. The window of opportunity had snapped shut. The race for Tunis had been lost to the superior speed of the German reaction and the debilitating effect of the weather and terrain on the overextended Allied logistics. General Eisenhower issued the order to halt the offensive and switch to a defensive stance for the remainder of the winter. The consequence of this failure was the establishment of a prolonged, bitter, and bloody 6-month siege, transforming the Tunisian campaign from a swift dash into a grueling war of attrition that would require immense resources and a steep learning curve for the inexperienced American forces. before the final, ultimate victory could be secured in the spring of 1943. Following the costly failure of the race for Tunis in December 1942, the Allied front in Tunisia solidified into a precarious, prolonged defensive line across the rugged, mountainous spine of the country. This lull in major offensive operations provided the brilliant German field commander Erwin Rommel with a final, desperate window of opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the now stationary Allied forces. Rommel correctly identified the greatest vulnerability on the Allied side, the inexperience and structural weaknesses of the American forces positioned on the western flank. The resulting clash, the Battle of Kasserine Pass, fought in mid-February 1943, became the American Army's painful and bloody introduction to the brutal realities of mobile mechanized warfare against highly trained German veterans. The American forces, primarily comprising the U.S. the Second Corps, were fresh, well-equipped, and eager, but fatally lacking in combat experience and cohesive command structure. Their tactical doctrine was rigid, often prioritizing static defense over the fluid, aggressive maneuvers demanded by the terrain and the enemy's philosophy. Furthermore, the American deployment was too widely dispersed, with units often failing to communicate or provide mutual support. Rommel, commanding a mixed but powerful force of German and Italian armor and infantry including elements of his formidable Afrika Corps, saw this opportunity and launched a concentrated, surprise counterattack designed to break the Allied lines, disrupt the entire logistical chain, and create chaos. The initial German attack, launched on February 14, 1943, was devastatingly successful. Rommel's combined Axis forces first struck the forward French and American positions, achieving a rapid, crushing breakthrough due to their superior use of concentrated armored thrusts and coordinated fire. The American defenders were completely overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the German blitzkrieg-style attack. Artillery support was slow to arrive, communication broke down, and critical positions were often abandoned prematurely. The inexperienced American tank crews, operating the M3 Lee and early M4 Sherman tanks, found their armor was often inferior to the heavier, longer-range guns of the German Tiger and PZ for special tanks, which could destroy the American armor from ranges outside the American effective firing distance. The fighting escalated into the strategic choke point of the Kasserine Pass, a crucial gap in the Atlas Mountains connecting the coastal plains to the interior. For days, the Axis forces drove relentlessly through the pass, shattering multiple American formations, including the 1st Armored Division. The American forces suffered thousands of casualties killed, wounded, and captured and lost hundreds of vital tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. This was the largest and most demoralizing single defeat suffered by the United States Army in the entire North African campaign, exposing severe shortcomings in leadership, doctrine, and the crucial integration of air, armor, and artillery. The panic and confusion extended far behind the front lines, leading to a temporary collapse of the Allied western flank. However, the German momentum was ultimately halted by the heroic, stubborn defense of certain integrated British and American artillery units, and primarily by Rommel's own crippling logistical constraints. Just as in earlier battles, the field commander had pushed his forces to the absolute limit without sufficient fuel and supply lines to sustain a prolonged offensive deep into the Allied rear. Faced with stiffening resistance from the newly deployed British reinforcements and the complete exhaustion of his own fuel reserves, Rommel was reluctantly forced to withdraw his forces back to their starting positions on February 24, 1943. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, despite being an undeniable tactical victory for Rommel, was an immediate and profound strategic turning point for the United States Army. The defeat led to critical, immediate changes, the removal and replacement of several high-ranking, ineffective commanders, a radical overhaul of tactical training emphasizing greater dispersion, better communication, and improved coordination of combined arms, and the immediate appointment of the abrasive but highly effective General George S. Patton to command the battered U.S. the Second Corps. Patton's arrival instilled discipline and an aggressive, winning spirit, transforming the defeated American forces into a highly capable, battle-hardened fighting force ready to participate in the final phases of the campaign. Kasserine was the painful but essential lesson that ultimately forged the future invasion force for Europe. Following the costly and deeply humiliating defeat suffered by the American forces at Kasserine Pass, the entirety of the Allied North African campaign entered its final, inevitable, and intensely focused phase, the systematic encirclement and destruction of the combined German and Italian forces within the narrow, strategic confines of Tunisia. The battle had now evolved from a fluid war of maneuver, defined by massive movements across the desert, into a brutal, compressed war of attrition, fought primarily across the unforgiving mountain ranges and along the coastal plains leading to the capital, Tunis. This final phase required immense strategic coordination, as the Allied forces were now advancing onto separate, converging fronts. In the east, the veteran British Eighth Army, under the meticulous command of General Bernard Montgomery, continued its relentless pursuit of the remaining Axis formations that had retreated after the decisive defeat at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Montgomery's forces pushed westward across Libya, successfully breaching the heavily fortified Axis defensive lines along the Mareth Line in southern Tunisia. The advance was cautious but unstoppable, characterized by overwhelming artillery support and absolute air superiority, which systematically pulverized the German and Italian defenses. The objective of the Eighth Army was clear: to pin down the Axis forces from the south, denying them any strategic depth and pushing them inexorably northward toward the Mediterranean Sea. In the west, the reformed and revitalized American II Corps, now under the dynamic and aggressive leadership of General George S. Patton, returned to the offensive with the fierce determination to redeem the failures of Kasserine Pass. Patton had immediately instituted radical changes in command structure, communication, and discipline, effectively forging the previously demoralized American forces into a hardened, capable fighting unit. The American objective was to drive eastward through the mountains, eliminating the final Axis resistance in the western hills, and ultimately link up with the British forces, completing the strategic encirclement. The fierce fighting across the rugged terrain of the Atlas Mountains was difficult, characterized by close-quarters infantry combat and tank battles fought over high passes, a dramatic contrast to the open desert fighting. The strategic culmination occurred in the spring of 1943, with the Eighth Army pressing from the south and the American and British First Army forces advancing from the west. The Axis forces, now commanded by General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim following Rommel's strategic transfer back to Europe for health and command reasons, were squeezed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around the port cities of Tunis and Bizerte. The German command, realizing the strategic hopelessness of their position, attempted one final, desperate series of counterattacks, but these were decisively repulsed by the superior Allied coordination and overwhelming air power. The sustained Allied air and naval dominance over the narrow sea lanes between Sicily and Tunisia meant that the Axis forces were completely cut off from necessary fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Their logistical pipeline had failed entirely. The final, devastating assault was launched in early May 1943. The British and American forces achieved a massive, simultaneous breakthrough, shattering the last organized German and Italian defensive lines. The Allied armies poured into the coastal plain, and the cities of Tunis and Bizerte fell rapidly. The military result was decisive and total. Unable to evacuate their massive forces due to complete Allied air and naval supremacy, the remaining Axis units were caught and forced into mass surrender. Between May 6 and May 13, 1943, the entire German and Italian force in North Africa, numbering an astonishing 275,000 men, formally laid down their arms and were taken as prisoners of war. The immense scale of this defeat, comparable in sheer numbers of captured soldiers to the massive encirclement losses suffered by the Soviet Union earlier in the war, signaled the complete and irreversible end of the Axis campaign in North Africa. The victory was total. The threat to the Suez Canal was eliminated, the Mediterranean Sea was secured, and the Allies had gained the crucial necessary strategic bases for the next phase of the war. The entire North African continent was now a secure Allied staging ground, and the door to Europe, through Italy, stood wide open. The final, complete surrender of the entire German and Italian force in Tunisia in May 1943 marked the definitive end of the Axis campaign in North Africa and a victory of profound, irreversible strategic consequence for the Allied powers. The success achieved in Operation Torch and the subsequent elimination of the enemy's presence in Africa was not just a regional victory. It was the essential strategic key that unlocked the next critical phases of the war, confirming the viability of the Allied coalition and securing the vital logistical foundation necessary for the invasion of Europe. The long, brutal war across the harsh desert had finally yielded its decisive reward. The most immediate and critical strategic outcome was the complete securing of the Mediterranean Sea. For years, the central Mediterranean had been a perilous zone, essentially closed to Allied shipping due to the relentless threat posed by Axis air and naval bases in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. With the entire southern shore of the sea now in Allied hands, and with the vital ports of North Africa fully operational as massive supply hubs, the sea lanes were effectively reopened. This massive logistical change immediately allowed Allied shipping to traverse the Mediterranean directly, drastically reducing the time required to transport essential supplies, men, and materiel from the United States and Britain to the forces in the Middle East and, crucially, to the embattled Soviet Union. Reopening the sea lanes saved months of transit time and freed up hundreds of valuable ships that had previously been tied down, making the immensely long, circuitous journey around the Cape of Good Hope. Furthermore, the conquest of North Africa served as the crucial proving ground for the massive, combined military forces of the United States and Great Britain. The early, painful failures, most notably the defeat suffered by the inexperienced American troops at the Kasserine Pass, forced immediate and deep reforms in command structure, military doctrine, and tactical integration. The subsequent triumph in Tunisia confirmed that the two great Western powers could effectively coordinate massive military, naval, and air forces under a unified command, a critical prerequisite for the success of the later, larger invasion of France. The American army, having endured its baptism of fire, emerged from the African campaign a hardened, capable, and aggressively led fighting force ready for the demands of the European theater. The victory also provided the Allies with the necessary launchpad for the next phase of the war against the Axis. With the entire North African coastline secured, the Allies now possessed a perfect geographic position to strike directly at the so-called soft underbelly of Europe. The strategic decision immediately following the victory was clear. The invasion of the Axis's most vulnerable partner, Italy, was imminent. The conquest of North Africa led directly to the subsequent invasions of Sicily, Operation Husky, and the Italian mainland, which were essential steps in tying down significant German divisions and diverting resources away from the desperate fighting on the Eastern Front. The opening of the Italian front forced the Germans into a costly, prolonged defensive struggle across the difficult mountainous terrain, preventing them from reinforcing their armies elsewhere. Finally, the campaign had a massive and debilitating effect on the German military. The loss of nearly 275,000 highly trained German and Italian soldiers taken as prisoners of war presented a catastrophic and irreplaceable drain on Axis manpower and material resources. This immense loss significantly weakened the German position across the entire Mediterranean and deprived Hitler of troops and equipment that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front. The continuous, heavy commitment required to sustain the North African defense had already severely taxed German logistics and naval resources in the Mediterranean, indirectly contributing to the ultimate Soviet success at Stalingrad, which occurred concurrently with the final stages of the North African campaign. The victory in Africa was truly a turning point, confirming the long-term strategic advantage of the Allies and setting the final, irreversible course toward the eventual liberation of Europe.